What happens when a human being becomes nothing more than a possession, passed from one tyrant to another like a piece of jewelry? In the blood-soaked chaos of ancient Rome's darkest hour, a young slave named Sporus endured a fate so grotesque that even the hardened chroniclers of the age struggled to record it without horror. His story is not merely one of suffering, it is a window into the absolute depravity that power can breed, and a testament to the fragility of human dignity when civilization itself begins to crumble. This is the story of Sporus, the boy who was forced to become an empress, and whose final days reveal the true cost of imperial madness. The Rome of 68 AD was a city teetering on the edge of an abyss. For 14 years, Emperor Nero had ruled with increasing erraticism, his reign a grotesque theater of artistic pretension and murderous paranoia. The Great Fire of 64 AD had already scarred the city's landscape and its collective memory, and whispers of Nero's involvement, whether true or false, had never fully subsided. By the spring of 68 AD, the emperor's grip on power had weakened to the point of collapse. Provincial governors were declaring themselves rivals to the throne. The Senate was emboldened by his absence of support, and the Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers meant to protect him, were wavering in their loyalty. In this atmosphere of impending catastrophe, Sporus found himself trapped at the center of a storm he could neither control nor escape. To understand Sporus's torment, one must first understand how he came to occupy such a peculiar and horrifying position. The historical sources, primarily the Roman historians Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, paint a picture of obsessive possession. After the death of Empress Poppaea Sabina in 65 AD, reportedly kicked to death by Nero while she was pregnant, the emperor descended into a grief so intense it bordered on insanity. Unable to accept his loss, Nero sought to recreate his dead wife in flesh and blood. His eyes fell upon Sporus, a young slave boy whose delicate features apparently bore some resemblance to the deceased empress. What followed was an act so transgressive that it shocked even a society accustomed to the excesses of imperial cruelty. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated, a procedure that in the ancient world was performed without anesthesia, often resulting in death from shock or infection. Those who survived bore lifelong physical and psychological scars. The operation involved the complete removal of the testicles and often the penis as well, leaving the victim in excruciating pain for weeks afterward. For Sporus, barely past childhood, this violation represented the destruction of his very identity. But the physical mutilation was only the beginning. Nero then dressed the boy in the robes and jewelry of an empress, applied cosmetics to his face, and paraded him through Rome as his wife, even conducting a public marriage ceremony complete with dowry and bridal veil. The wedding was celebrated with all the pomp befitting an imperial union, a grotesque mockery that forced Rome's elite to participate in the emperor's delusion or risk his wrath. The contemporary sources describe Sporus being kissed and caressed by Nero in public, treated with the affections one might show a beloved spouse, yet simultaneously regarded as property. Suetonius records that Nero would call Sporus by Poppaea's name, weeping over him and speaking to him as though he were the reincarnation of his dead wife. For Sporus, every moment of this existence was a negation of self. He was neither male nor female, neither free nor truly enslaved in the traditional sense, but rather a living symbol of another person's memory, denied even the basic recognition of his own humanity. He was dressed in the finest silks, adorned with precious gems, and attended by servants, yet he possessed nothing, not even ownership of his own body or identity. This was his reality when Nero's world began to collapse in the spring of 68 AD. The rebellion that would end Nero's reign began far from Rome, in the provinces where governors had grown weary of sending tribute to fund the emperor's artistic vanities and architectural fantasies. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, was the first to openly revolt, though his rebellion was quickly crushed. More significantly, Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared himself a representative of the Senate and Roman people, effectively challenging Nero's authority. When the Praetorian Guard in Rome defected to Galba's cause, Nero's fate was sealed. The Senate declared him a public enemy, and the traditional punishment for such a condemnation was to be stripped naked, fastened by the neck in a wooden fork, and beaten to death with rods. Nero fled the city in the night of June 9th, 68 AD, accompanied by only a handful of loyal servants, and notably Sporus. In the chaos of that desperate flight, Sporus witnessed the complete unraveling of the man who had destroyed his life. The emperor who had commanded legions and executed senators with a word now cowered in a villa outside Rome, weeping and unable to muster the courage to end his own life. According to the historical accounts, Nero repeatedly brought a dagger to his throat but could not complete the act, instead lamenting his fate and quoting Greek poetry. When the sound of approaching horsemen, soldiers coming to arrest him, finally forced his hand, Nero required the assistance of his secretary Epaphroditos to drive the blade home. His last words were reportedly, "What an artist dies in me," a final expression of narcissism that defined his reign. For Sporus, watching this pathetic end, there must have been a complex mixture of emotions, perhaps relief that his tormentor was gone, but also terror at what would come next. He was correct to be afraid. In the power vacuum that followed Nero's death, Sporus became a strange sort of trophy, a symbol of connection to the previous regime that various figures sought to possess. The first to claim him was Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who had orchestrated the guard's betrayal of Nero. Nymphidius was a man of dubious parentage who harbored grandiose ambitions. He claimed to be the illegitimate son of Emperor Caligula and believed this entitled him to imperial power. In the weeks following Nero's suicide, as Galba made his slow journey from Spain to Rome, Nymphidius began to position himself as a potential emperor. In a disturbing echo of Nero's behavior, he took Sporus as his own, treating the boy as a wife and calling him Poppaea, just as Nero had done. For Sporus, this must have felt like a nightmare from which there was no waking. The circumstances had changed, but his essential condition remained the same. Nymphidius's ambitions, however, were short-lived. When he attempted to rally the Praetorian Guard to support his claim to the throne, the soldiers, who had already pledged themselves to Galba, turned on him with sudden violence. The man who had betrayed one emperor was himself betrayed, cut down by the very troops he sought to command. The murder was brutal and public, his body left to be desecrated by the mob. Once again, Sporus found himself the property of a dead man, his fate uncertain in a city that grew more chaotic by the day. The year of the 4 emperors had begun, and Sporus would be caught in its terrible currents, passed from hand to hand like a curious relic of a fallen age. When Galba finally entered Rome in October of 68 AD, he did so as an elderly man of 73, stern and parsimonious, determined to restore fiscal responsibility to an empire bankrupted by Nero's excesses. His reign would last only 7 months, but during this time, Sporus remained in an uncertain position within the imperial household. The historical sources are less clear about his status during Galba's brief rule, but we know that he survived and that his presence continued to fascinate and disturb those around him. Galba, unlike Nero, had no interest in the boy as a companion, viewing him instead as an embarrassing remnant of his predecessor's depravity. Yet Sporus was not freed, nor was he allowed to fade into obscurity. Instead, he remained a visible reminder of Nero's reign, his very existence a living scandal that the new administration could neither fully embrace nor entirely discard. The political situation in Rome deteriorated rapidly under Galba's administration. His refusal to pay the donative, the customary gift of money that he had promised to the Praetorian Guard, alienated the very force that had brought him to power. His fiscal austerity, while perhaps necessary, was deeply unpopular among both the military and the common people who had grown accustomed to Nero's lavish spectacles and distributions of grain and money. Provincial armies, particularly those in Germania, began to agitate for their own candidates. The empire was fragmenting, loyalty was for sale, and violence simmered just beneath the surface of civic order. In this environment, Sporus's fate was tied to forces entirely beyond his control, his body a piece on a board whose rules he had never been permitted to learn. On January 15th, 69 AD, the Praetorian Guard and the German legions revolted against Galba, proclaiming Marcus Salvius Otho as emperor. Otho was a man with his own peculiar connection to the tragedy of Sporus. He had once been married to Poppaea Sabina, the very woman whose memory had led to Sporus's mutilation and humiliation. Nero had coveted Poppaea while she was Otho's wife and had sent Otho away as governor of Lusitania in order to take her for himself. Now, in a twist of fate so bizarre that it reads like Greek tragedy, Otho found himself in possession of the boy who had been transformed into a simulacrum of his former wife. The psychological complexity of this situation for both Otho and Sporus is almost impossible to fully comprehend across the millennia. Galba's end came swiftly and brutally. He was murdered in the Roman Forum by Praetorian soldiers, beheaded, and his severed head was carried through the streets on a lance before being mockingly offered to the emperor's former servants. His adopted heir, Piso Licinianus, was also killed, as were many of Galba's closest supporters. The violence of the transition was a harbinger of the bloodshed to come. Otho assumed power with the backing of the Praetorian Guard, but his position was immediately contested by Aulus Vitellius, commander of the legions in Germania, who had been proclaimed emperor by his own troops just days after Otho's elevation. Rome would soon be plunged into civil war, and Sporus would witness yet another emperor claim him as a possession. During Otho's brief 3-month reign, Sporus occupied a strange position in the imperial court. According to Plutarch and Cassius Dio, Otho treated the boy with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. On the one hand, Sporus represented a connection to Poppaea, the woman Otho had loved and lost to Nero. On the other hand, he was a disturbing reminder of Nero's depravity and the unnatural acts that had been inflicted upon this youth. There are suggestions in the sources that Otho may have treated Sporus with some degree of kindness, or at least less cruelty than his predecessors, perhaps out of sympathy for their shared connection to Poppaea. Yet kindness within the context of slavery and mutilation can only be a relative term. Sporus remained unfree, his body still bearing the irreversible marks of Nero's obsession, his identity still subsumed beneath the name of a dead woman. As Otho prepared for war against Vitellius, Rome itself became an armed camp. Soldiers filled the streets, fortifications were erected, and the civilian population lived in fear of the coming conflict. The armies of Vitellius, composed primarily of German and Gallic legionaries, marched toward Italy with a reputation for ferocity and indiscipline. They were larger, more experienced, and better positioned than Otho's forces, which relied heavily on the Praetorian Guard and hastily assembled legions from the Balkans. Otho's strategic position was weak, but he was determined to fight rather than surrender. For Sporus, watching these preparations, the future must have seemed increasingly dark. He had already survived 3 emperors and 2 violent transitions of power. The prospect of a 4th seemed almost unbearable. The decisive battle came on April 14th, 69 AD, at Bedriacum in northern Italy. Despite some initial successes, Otho's forces were comprehensively defeated by the Vitellian army. The casualties were enormous. Thousands of Roman soldiers died fighting other Romans in a conflict driven entirely by personal ambition rather than any principle of state. When news of the defeat reached Otho, he made the decision to take his own life rather than prolong the civil war. Unlike Nero, who had dithered and required assistance, Otho faced his end with stoic determination. On April 16th, after making arrangements for the safety of his household and distributing money to his servants, he retired to his chamber and stabbed himself through the heart. He was 37 years old and had ruled for just 95 days. With Otho's death, Sporus once again found himself the property of a new master. Vitellius entered Rome in July of 69 AD, having spent the intervening months consolidating his control over Italy and dealing with the aftermath of Betrayal. His arrival was marked by disturbing scenes of military excess. His German soldiers, unused to the wealth and luxury of Rome, engaged in looting and violence that the new emperor seemed unable or unwilling to control. Vitellius himself was a man of different character than his predecessors. Where Nero had been artistic and theatrical, Galba austere and disciplined, and Otho conflicted and ultimately tragic, Vitellius was primarily characterized by gluttony and a certain crude populism. He staged elaborate public feasts, distributed largesse to the mob, and indulged in the pleasures of food and drink with such abandon that the ancient sources describe him with barely concealed disgust. For Sporus, the transition to Vitellius's control marked the beginning of his worst nightmare. Where Nero had at least treated him with a twisted form of affection, and where Otho may have shown some sympathy, Vitellius regarded Sporus with contempt and saw in him an opportunity for public entertainment of the most degrading kind. The new emperor, eager to curry favor with the Roman mob and to distance himself from the memory of Nero, conceived of a spectacle that would simultaneously humiliate the boy and provide the kind of violent amusement that Romans had enjoyed for centuries in the arena. Vitellius announced that Sporus would be forced to participate in a public reenactment of the rape of Proserpina, one of the most violent and sexually explicit myths in the classical tradition. The myth of Proserpina, or Persephone in the Greek tradition, tells the story of the daughter of Ceres, goddess of the harvest, who was abducted by Pluto, god of the underworld, and dragged down to his dark kingdom to become his unwilling bride. The myth was fundamentally about violation and loss, about innocence destroyed and the eternal grief of a mother. In the Roman theatrical and gladiatorial traditions, such myths were sometimes enacted in the arena, with criminals or slaves forced to play the roles, often resulting in actual injury or death. The rape of Proserpina would have involved Sporus being dressed as the maiden goddess, pursued and violently seized by an actor or gladiator playing Pluto, and subjected to simulated or perhaps even actual sexual assault before a crowd of thousands. It was to be the ultimate degradation, a public execution of whatever remained of Sporus's dignity and humanity. The prospect of this fate appears to have been the final breaking point for Sporus. After enduring years of unimaginable abuse, castration, forced marriage, being passed from one emperor to another, having his identity systematically erased, the announcement of Vitellius's plans pushed him beyond the limits of endurance. The sources tell us that in 69 AD, sometime before the planned spectacle could take place, Sporus took his own life. The exact method is not recorded in detail, though suicide by blade or poison were the most common means in the ancient world for those who had access to them. What we do know is that Sporus chose death over the final humiliation that Vitellius had designed for him, asserting in his final act the only form of control he had ever possessed, the choice to end his own suffering. The decision to end one's life in the ancient Roman world carried different connotations than it might in modern contexts. For Romans of the upper classes, suicide in the face of dishonor or defeat was often viewed as a noble act, a final assertion of dignity and autonomy. Famous examples include Cato the Younger, who killed himself rather than live under Caesar's dictatorship, or Seneca, forced to suicide by Nero, who faced his death with philosophical composure. But Sporus was not a senator or a philosopher. He was a slave, someone whose life had been considered worthless except as an instrument for others' pleasure or political purposes. Yet in choosing death, he demonstrated that even in the most complete powerlessness, the human spirit retains a core of will that cannot be entirely extinguished. His suicide was not a noble gesture in the Roman aristocratic tradition, but rather the desperate act of someone for whom continued existence had become literally unbearable. We should pause to consider what Sporus's final moments might have been like. The sources, written by men of privilege who viewed slaves as fundamentally different from themselves, give us no personal details, no last words, no glimpse into his internal state. We do not know if he was alone when he died, or if there were others present. We do not know if he felt fear or relief or both. We do not know if he thought of his life before Nero, if such memories even remained accessible after years of trauma. What we can infer from the mere fact of his suicide is that he possessed enough awareness to understand what awaited him under Vitellius, enough imagination to find it intolerable, and enough determination to choose an alternative. These are not the qualities of an object or a possession, but of a person whom history has remembered primarily through the lens of his victimization, but who in his final act reclaimed, however tragically, his own agency. The historical sources record Sporus's death as a footnote to the larger narrative of the Year of the Four Emperors. Suetonius mentions it briefly. Cassius Dio provides a few more details, and that is essentially all we have. To the historians of Rome, Sporus was a curiosity, an anecdote illustrating the depravity of Nero and the chaos of 69 AD. They did not consider his inner life, his suffering, or his humanity worthy of extended consideration. This is, in itself, a form of violence, the erasure of a person's experience from the historical record, their reduction to a symbol or a cautionary tale. Yet even in these brief, dismissive references, we can discern the outlines of a tragedy that speaks to fundamental questions about power, identity, and human dignity. Sporus's story forces us to confront the absolute nature of slavery in the ancient world and the particular vulnerabilities of the enslaved to sexual violence and bodily violation. Roman society, for all its achievements in law, engineering, and governance, was built on a foundation of human exploitation. Slavery was ubiquitous. Estimates suggest that in the 1st century AD, slaves may have constituted 20 to 30% of the population of Italy, and even higher percentages in major cities like Rome. These were not merely servants or laborers, but human beings with no legal rights, subject entirely to the will of their owners. An owner could beat, maim, sexually assault, or kill their slaves with relative impunity, especially if the slave was young and powerless. Sporus's experience, while extreme, was not unique in kind. Countless others suffered similar or worse fates, their names and stories lost to history. The specific horror of Sporus's castration deserves further consideration. Eunuchs existed in various ancient societies, particularly in the East, where they often served in royal courts and could attain positions of considerable influence. However, in Rome, castration was viewed with particular revulsion. Roman law, in fact, prohibited the castration of Roman citizens, though this protection did not extend to slaves or foreigners. The procedure was associated with Eastern decadence and was seen as fundamentally un-Roman, a violation of natural order. For Nero to have ordered the castration of Sporus was therefore not just a personal cruelty, but a transgression of Roman cultural norms, another example of the emperor's alienation from traditional values. The physical consequences of prepubescent castration were severe and lifelong. In addition to sterility, victims would not develop secondary sexual characteristics. Their voices would remain high-pitched, their bone structure would not fully develop, and they would require ongoing medical care for various health complications. Beyond the physical damage, the psychological impact of such mutilation and the subsequent treatment Sporus endured would have been catastrophic. Modern psychology has developed frameworks for understanding trauma, particularly developmental trauma and complex PTSD, that can help us comprehend what Sporus might have experienced. To be violated at a young age, to have one's body permanently altered without consent, to be forced into a false identity, to be treated as an object of desire while being denied any agency. These experiences would produce profound dissociation, identity confusion, and emotional dysregulation. Sporus would have had no therapeutic resources, no framework for understanding his trauma, and no escape from the ongoing source of his suffering. He existed in a state of continuous traumatization, each new emperor and each new humiliation compounding the damage that had already been done. The period known as the Year of the Four Emperors, from June 68th AD to December 69th AD, was one of the most chaotic and violent in Roman history. 4 men claimed the imperial throne in rapid succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, who emerged victorious and founded the Flavian dynasty. The civil wars of this period saw Roman armies fighting each other across Italy and the provinces, cities sacked, tens of thousands killed, and the illusion of imperial stability shattered. For ordinary people living through these events, the experience would have been terrifying. Authority was uncertain, violence was unpredictable, and the social order that had provided at least the appearance of security was revealed to be fragile and contingent. For someone in Sporus's position, with no protection and no rights, the chaos would have been exponentially more dangerous. He was entirely dependent on the whims of whoever held power, and as emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, his vulnerability only increased. It is worth considering the various men who possessed Sporus and what their treatment of him reveals about their characters. Nero, the original architect of Sporus's suffering, was driven by grief and narcissism to recreate his dead wife in living flesh, demonstrating a complete inability to distinguish between his own desires and another person's humanity. Nymphidius Sabinus, in adopting the same practice, showed himself to be not just ambitious, but eager to emulate the very emperor he had betrayed, suggesting that his objection to Nero was political rather than moral. Otho's relationship with Sporus is more ambiguous. There are hints of sympathy, but also possession. He did not free Sporus or restore his identity, even if he may have treated him more gently than others. Vitellius represents perhaps the cruelest iteration. He saw Sporus not as a wife substitute or even as a person, but as raw material for public entertainment, demonstrating the complete commodification of human life that the arena represented. The arena itself requires some discussion to fully appreciate the horror of what Vitellius planned for Sporus. Roman spectacles, gladiatorial games, beast hunts, public executions were central to the culture of the city and empire. These events served multiple functions. They demonstrated imperial largesse, they reinforced social hierarchies by displaying the power of life and death over the condemned, and they provided cathartic entertainment for crowds that could number in the tens of thousands. The Colosseum, though not yet built in Sporus's time, would later become the iconic symbol of this aspect of Roman civilization. But the games were not merely combat between professional fighters. They also included elaborate theatrical executions, where criminals and prisoners were forced to act out mythological scenes that ended in their actual deaths. A person might be dressed as Orpheus and torn apart by actual bears, or as Icarus and dropped from a great height. The rape of Proserpina would have fit this tradition perfectly, a mythological narrative brought to life through the suffering of real human beings. Such spectacles reveal something profound and disturbing about Roman culture. Here was a civilization that produced magnificent literature, sophisticated philosophy, and complex legal systems, yet also entertained itself with industrialized cruelty. The contradiction is not accidental, but intrinsic. The same society that valued dignitas and honor for its citizens considered the suffering of non-citizens as entertainment. This cognitive dissonance was maintained through ideological work. Slaves and criminals were constructed as fundamentally different, less than fully human, deserving of their fate. Yet even within Roman culture, there were critics. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who had served as Nero's advisor, wrote with discomfort about the arena's brutality. Tacitus, our primary historical source for this period, records the events of the civil wars with a tone of deep pessimism about the corruption of Roman values. The culture was not monolithic, but the dominant structures of power depended on the exploitation and dehumanization of the vulnerable. Sporus's final act of suicide can be read as a form of resistance, however tragic. In a life where every other form of autonomy had been stripped away, the choice to die became the only choice remaining. This paradox, that death can represent freedom, speaks to the extremity of his oppression. Scholars who study slavery and totalitarianism have noted that suicide is sometimes the final assertion of selfhood for those who have been systematically objectified. It is a way of saying, you may control my body, but you cannot force me to continue existing in this form. For Sporus, the prospect of being raped and humiliated before thousands, of having his suffering transformed into entertainment, was apparently worse than death itself. His suicide denied Vitellius the spectacle he had planned, asserting in negation what could not be asserted in positive action, that Sporus was a person, not merely a prop in someone else's narrative. We do not know what happened to Sporus's body after his death. Roman practices varied depending on social status. Citizens might be cremated with elaborate funerary rites, while slaves were often disposed of with little ceremony. Given his peculiar status, neither quite a slave in the conventional sense, nor a free person, having been the wife of emperors, it is impossible to say. Perhaps his body was simply discarded, or perhaps someone who had known him arranged for a more dignified end. The sources are silent on this point, as they are silent on so much of his actual experience. What we are left with is a name, a few paragraphs in ancient texts, and the bare facts of an existence defined by victimization. The brevity of the historical record should not, however, lead us to dismiss Sporus's significance. His story illuminates aspects of Roman society that are sometimes obscured in accounts that focus on emperors and senators. It reveals the absolute vulnerability of enslaved bodies, particularly young bodies, to sexual violence. It demonstrates how political chaos and civil war create conditions where such violence intensifies and becomes even more arbitrary. It shows us how individual human beings can become symbols in larger political narratives while losing their own humanity in the process. And it raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of civilization itself, about what it means that a culture of tremendous achievement in arts and governance could simultaneously treat human beings as disposable objects of amusement. Modern readers approaching Sporus's story may struggle with its extremity. It is tempting to see the events as uniquely ancient, products of a savage age that we have long since surpassed. Such complacency would be a mistake. While the specific forms of exploitation may have changed, the underlying dynamics, the vulnerability of the powerless, the capacity of those with authority to dehumanize others, the connection between entertainment and violence, remain relevant. Throughout history and into the present, we can find examples of people treated as objects, their bodies violated, their identities erased, their suffering spectacularized. The mechanisms may differ, but the fundamental failure of empathy and the structures of power that enable such failure persist. Consider, for instance, the ways that sexual violence has been and continues to be used as a weapon of war and a tool of domination. From the systematic rape campaigns in Bosnia and Rwanda to the sexual exploitation of trafficked persons today, the pattern of powerful individuals or groups using sexual violence to assert control over the powerless remains depressingly consistent. Consider also the ways that public humiliation and spectacle continue to function in our media landscape, where the suffering or degradation of others becomes consumable content. While we may not literally force people to reenact mythological rapes in arenas, the impulse to transform human suffering into entertainment has found new technological expressions. Sporus's story also speaks to questions of gender and bodily autonomy that remain contested. He was forcibly castrated and compelled to perform a female identity that was not his own, his body altered to suit someone else's fantasy. In doing so, Nero violated both Sporus's bodily integrity and his gender identity, imposing an external definition that overwrote the boy's own sense of self. This is not to appropriate Sporus's experience for modern debates about gender, but rather to note that questions about who has the right to define and control bodies, about the relationship between biological sex and social gender, about the violence of imposed identities, these are not new questions. They have existed as long as power imbalances have enabled some people to control others. The psychological concept of objectification helps us understand part of what happened to Sporus. Objectification occurs when a person is treated as a thing, as an instrument for another's purposes, rather than as a subject with their own agency and interiority. In extreme cases, objectification can lead to treating people as literally interchangeable with inanimate objects, something we see in Nero's attempt to transform Sporus into a replacement for Poppaea, as though a dead person could simply be recreated by manipulating a living one's body. This kind of thinking requires a profound failure of empathy, an inability or unwillingness to recognize the other as fundamentally like oneself, as possessing the same capacity for suffering and the same essential dignity. Yet we must be careful not to reduce Sporus to a victim only. While his suffering was real and his powerlessness was nearly absolute, he was still a person who made choices within the constraints available to him. His final choice, to end his life rather than endure further degradation, was an assertion of will, however desperate. Throughout his ordeal, he must have made countless small choices about how to respond, how to survive, how to maintain some sense of self in circumstances designed to destroy it. The fact that he survived as long as he did, through multiple regime changes and varying forms of abuse, suggests reserves of resilience that the sources do not acknowledge, but which must have existed. We do not have access to his internal life, but we can affirm that it existed, that his experience was subjective and complex, and that reducing him to the role of passive victim is itself a form of disrespect. The historical legacy of the Year of the Four Emperors extended far beyond Sporus's death. Vespasian, who emerged victorious from the civil wars, founded a new dynasty that would rule for 27 years and preside over a period of relative stability and prosperity. The Flavians, as they were known, sought to distance themselves from the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ended with Nero, and to present themselves as restoring traditional Roman values. They built the Colosseum. The name itself comes from a colossal statue of Nero that stood nearby, as a gift to the Roman people, constructed on the site of Nero's private palace. In doing so, they transformed a space of imperial excess into a space of public entertainment, though as we have seen, that entertainment involved its own forms of cruelty. The memory of Nero became a useful foil, a cautionary tale about tyranny and excess that subsequent emperors could define themselves against. In this process of memory construction, Sporus became a symbol of Nero's depravity. The ancient historians who recorded his story did so primarily to illustrate how far Nero had strayed from acceptable norms. The very fact that Nero had castrated a slave boy, dressed him as a woman, and married him publicly was presented as evidence of the emperor's madness and moral corruption. The same-sex nature of the relationship was particularly scandalous to Roman sensibilities, not because Rome lacked same-sex sexual activity, which was quite common, but because the relationship violated proper hierarchies and roles. A Roman man was expected to be the active partner, the penetrator in any sexual encounter. To be penetrated or to play the female role was deeply shameful for a free man. By casting Sporus as his wife, Nero was not just violating the boy, but also symbolically violating proper Roman masculinity itself. But notice what is absent from the ancient accounts: any consideration of Sporus as a person with his own experience and suffering. The historians were not interested in his pain or his perspective. They were interested in what his treatment revealed about emperors and politics. This is characteristic of ancient sources, which rarely center the experiences of the enslaved or the powerless. We have extensive records of elite Roman life, their speeches, their letters, their political maneuverings. But the vast majority of people who lived in the Roman Empire, the slaves and peasants and provincials who made up most of the population, appear in our sources only as background figures, if at all. To reconstruct Sporus's experience, we must read against the grain of sources that mention him only to make other points, extracting from brief references and dismissive comments the outlines of a human tragedy. In the final analysis, Sporus's story is about the encounter between absolute power and absolute vulnerability. Nero had the power to remake reality according to his desires, to transform a boy's body to match his fantasy of recreating a dead woman. Vitellius had the power to plan a public spectacle of rape and humiliation, confident that no one would stop him. Sporus had only his own body, and, in the end, only his own death. The asymmetry is complete and terrible. Yet even in this extreme asymmetry, there is evidence of irreducible humanity. The humanity that allowed Sporus to choose death over degradation, that made his suicide an act of refusal rather than mere submission. This is not a consolation, not a happy ending, but it is important. It reminds us that even the most complete systems of domination cannot fully erase the subjectivity of their victims, that human beings retain some core of agency, however constrained, that we are never mere objects, however much we are treated as such. We do not know what Sporus might have become had he lived in different circumstances. What were his talents, his interests, his dreams? What would he have chosen for himself if choice had been available to him? These questions have no answers, and their very unanswerability is part of the tragedy. His potential was never realized. His choices were never free. His life was never his own. He was denied the opportunity to become whoever he might have been, and that denial is an irreparable loss, not just to him, but to the world. Every person who is prevented from flourishing, whose possibilities are foreclosed by violence and oppression, represents a loss to human potential that can never be recovered. Multiply Sporus by the millions of others who have suffered similar fates throughout history, enslaved, exploited, destroyed before they could bloom, and the scale of human waste becomes almost incomprehensible. This is why it matters to tell these stories, however painful they are to hear. We honor the dead, not by pretending their suffering was meaningful or redemptive, but by acknowledging its reality, by refusing to look away, by using their stories to inform our understanding of what humans are capable of, both the cruelty we can inflict and the suffering we can endure. Sporus lived and died in the 1st century AD, nearly 2,000 years ago. His bones have long since turned to dust. His name survived only in a few scattered references by ancient historians who cared nothing for him as a person. Yet, here we are, reconstructing his story, trying to understand his experience, attempting to grant him in death the recognition of his humanity that he was denied in life. It is too late to save him, too late to offer protection or comfort. But it is not too late to remember, to witness, to let his story change us and the way we think about power, dignity, and the obligations we owe to the vulnerable. The final image we are left with is of a young person facing an impossible choice and choosing death. We do not know where he died or who, if anyone, was with him in those final moments. We do not know if death came quickly or if there was time for reflection, for fear, for final thoughts about the life he had lived and the one he would never have. What we know is that he looked at what awaited him, the public violation, the laughter of the crowd, the reduction of his suffering to entertainment, and decided that he would not participate. In a life where nearly everything had been taken from him, he took one thing for himself, the final moment, the last decision. It was a victory bought at the highest possible price, and it should never have been necessary. But it was his, and in remembering it, we recognize him not as a victim only, not as a curiosity or an anecdote, but as a person who lived and suffered and chose and died, whose brief life touched the edge of history and left behind a story that still, after all these centuries, has the power to move us.